Somewhere in America right now, a family is being priced out of a home they never got the chance to buy. Not because of interest rates alone, not because of inflation in the abstract, but because of a single policy decision made at the highest level of government that set in motion a chain of consequences that economists, builders, and ordinary citizens are still reckoning with today. The question worth asking is not simply whether the decision was right or wrong. The deeper question is this: how does a country with 300 billion trees end up paying more for wood than at almost any point in its modern history? And who, exactly, is bearing the cost of that contradiction? To understand what happened, you have to go back further than the headlines. And the relationship between American builders and Canadian lumber is not a recent convenience. It is a structural feature of the North American economy, built over decades of cross-border trade, shared supply chains, and complementary industrial capacity. Canada produces an abundance of softwood timber, particularly from British Columbia and Quebec. The United States, despite its vast forests, has never developed the sawmill infrastructure to process domestic timber at the scale its housing market demands. This is not a political talking point. It is a documented industrial reality. As of early 2026, American sawmills are operating at approximately 64% of their potential capacity, and that figure has been declining steadily since 2017. The trees exist. The industry to convert them into usable lumber does not, and at least not at the scale required. Canada has historically supplied nearly 85% of all softwood lumber imported into the United States. That is not a small dependency. That is a structural pillar of the American construction economy. And for years, that arrangement was treated as a point of mutual benefit, a feature of the integrated North American market rather than a vulnerability to be exploited or eliminated. But the political framing around that dependency began to shift. The argument, gaining force in certain policy circles, was that reliance on Canadian lumber represented a strategic weakness, that American forests were being under-leveraged, that domestic production could and should fill the gap. It was an argument grounded in a genuine economic aspiration, but one that collided with a harder set of facts about industrial capacity, workforce availability, and the time required to build supply chains from the ground up. In March of 2025, President Trump directed the Commerce Department to initiate what is known as a Section 232 investigation into timber and lumber imports. Section 232 is a legal mechanism that grants the executive branch authority to impose tariffs on imported goods if those goods are determined to pose a threat to national security. The framing of lumber as a national security issue was notable. The Commerce Department's case rested on the argument that wood products serve critical functions in military construction, housing for defense personnel, transportation of munitions, and even as components in missile defense systems and thermal protection for nuclear re-entry vehicles. These claims were not invented. Wood does serve those functions. But the national security designation also opened a legal pathway to tariffs that bypassed the usual legislative and trade dispute processes, and that choice of pathway carries its own implications worth examining. By September 30th of 2025, the investigation concluded and President Trump signed a presidential proclamation imposing a 10% tariff on all imported softwood timber and lumber under Section 232 authority. The proclamation also included a 25% tariff on kitchen cabinets, bathroom vanities, and upholstered wooden furniture. These measures took effect on October 14th, 2025. Then, on the first day of 2026, the tariff on kitchen cabinets escalated further to 50%, and the tariff on upholstered wooden furniture rose to 30%. To understand the cumulative weight of these numbers, it helps to know what was already in place before this new layer was added. Canadian softwood lumber had been subject to anti-dumping and countervailing duties for years, the product of long-standing trade disputes between the two countries. Those existing duties already totaled approximately 35%. When the new 10% Section 232 tariff was stacked on top, Canadian lumber entering the American market was suddenly facing total duties exceeding 45%. The word cumulative is important here. Each individual tariff might seem manageable in isolation. Stacked together, they represent a fundamental repricing of one of the most essential raw materials in the construction industry. It is worth pausing to think about the decision-making architecture behind this moment. The Section 232 authority concentrates enormous economic power in the executive branch. It allows a single presidential proclamation to reshape pricing across an entire sector of the economy, affecting millions of contracts, thousands of businesses, and the purchasing decisions of ordinary families without requiring a legislative vote or an extended period of public deliberation. That concentration of authority was intentional, built into the law for moments of genuine national emergency. The debate about whether this situation qualified as such an emergency is one that legal scholars, economists, and courts have been actively working through. In February of 2026, the Supreme Court ruled 6-3 that a separate tariff authority, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, does not authorize tariffs. But the Section 232 lumber tariffs were imposed under different legal grounds and survived that ruling. They remain in effect. This is where the story becomes something more than a trade dispute. It becomes a study in the distance between policy intent and policy outcome. On January 20th, 2025, the first day of the Trump administration, the president signed an executive order directing all relevant agencies to pursue emergency price relief with the explicit goal of lowering the cost of housing and increasing housing supply. That was the stated objective: lower costs, more homes. And those two goals were positioned as central to the administration's domestic agenda. What followed, in the months after that declaration, was a tariff structure that the National Association of Home Builders, the Brookings Institution, the Center for American Progress, Yale's Budget Lab, and virtually every major housing economist in the country concluded would do the opposite. The numbers that have emerged from independent analyses are significant enough to examine in detail. The National Association of Home Builders, which represents the industry actually building homes across the United States, estimates that tariffs have already added approximately $9,200 to the average cost of a new single-family home. The Center for American Progress published a more expansive analysis in December of 2025, placing that figure at around $17,500 per new home. NBC News conducted its own independent modeling, cataloging materials for a representative single-family home and mapping each to import data. Their estimate was a minimum of $4,400 added to materials costs alone, and analysts who reviewed the methodology described it as conservative because it did not account for labor cost increases. Looking further out, the Center for American Progress projects that tariff-induced cost increases will result in approximately 450,000 fewer homes being built over the next 5 years through 2030. 450,000 units in a country where the existing housing shortage is estimated at somewhere between 3.7 million and 7 million units, depending on the methodology used. The Brookings Institution calculated that current tariffs will add roughly $30 billion to the cost of investment in residential structures, with approximately 90% of that burden falling on new homes and apartments. These are not minor adjustments to the margin. They represent a measurable compression of the country's ability to build its way out of a housing crisis. The people absorbing those costs are worth looking at with some specificity. There is a building materials supplier in Farmingdale, New York, a company called J.C. Ryan, which had a contract to supply wooden doors and frames for an apartment complex in Nassau County. Half of the order had already been delivered before the tariffs took effect. On the remaining portion, valued at $75,000, the tariff added $19,000 to the actual cost. After the supplier applied its standard markup, the customer owed $30,000 more than the original contract price on one order of wooden doors. In San Diego, a contractor named Bar Zakim operates a company called Better Place Design and Build, specializing in accessory dwelling units. He has continued to source lumber from Canada because it remains the most competitive option. The result is that his prices have risen approximately 15% compared to the previous year. In his own words, he is not about to go out of business, but it is shaping up to be a slow, expensive year. These individual accounts are not anomalies. The Federal Reserve's Beige Book, the document that aggregates economic conditions across all 12 regional Federal Reserve districts, explicitly highlighted concerns from construction contacts about rising lumber prices. 4 regional banks, including those covering Richmond, St. Louis, Kansas City, and San Francisco, referenced heightened worry about building material costs. There is a dimension of this story that tends to get lost in aggregate statistics, and it concerns the difference in how large and small builders experience these cost increases. The major national home builders, companies like Toll Brothers, Lennar, and D.R. Horton, operate with long-term supply contracts that provide some insulation from near-term price shocks. They have purchasing power, established relationships, and financial reserves that allow them to absorb or delay the impact. The small and mid-sized builder, the company building 10 or 15 homes a year in a local market, and has none of those advantages. That builder is purchasing materials at current market prices, and when those prices increase sharply, the options are limited. Absorb the loss, pass the cost to the buyer, or stop building. Single-family home construction starts in April of 2025. We're down 12% compared to April of 2024. Builders across the country are inserting escalation clauses into contracts because they cannot reliably project what materials will cost from one month to the next. Lenders are growing more cautious in underwriting construction loans for the same reason. The response from Canada deserves attention because it has implications that extend well beyond the immediate dispute. Prime Minister Mark Carney announced a significant support package for the Canadian lumber and steel industries, including $700 million in loan guarantees and $500 million in long-term diversification support. The strategic objective was explicit: to help Canadian producers find buyers outside of the United States. Canada has also reduced freight rates for moving lumber domestically by 50%, facilitating the reorientation of supply toward Asian, European, and Middle Eastern markets. Carney was direct in his assessment of what this transition represents. He observed that 90% of Canada's lumber exports, 90% of its aluminum exports, and 90% of its steel exports had been flowing to a single market. That concentration, once understood as a sign of deep integration, had become a vulnerability. Canada is now working, with government backing and institutional urgency, to permanently reduce that vulnerability. The long-term implications of that pivot deserve serious consideration. If Canada succeeds in establishing durable trade relationships with alternative buyers over the next several years, the supply of Canadian lumber that has historically been available to American builders on relatively favorable terms may simply not be available in the future, or not at the same volume, or not at the same price. The market relationship that was built over decades cannot necessarily be rebuilt on demand once it has been dismantled. When American builders eventually need to draw on Canadian supply at greater volumes, which the current domestic production trajectory suggests they will, the terms of that relationship may have shifted permanently. The Tax Foundation has described the Trump tariffs collectively as the largest U.S. tax increase as a percentage of gross domestic product since 1993. That framing positions the tariff regime not as an external burden imposed by a foreign competitor, but as a domestic policy choice with domestic fiscal consequences. The Budget Lab at Yale estimates that overall construction sector output could fall by 4.1% over the next 3 years as a result of tariff-related cost increases. Against the backdrop of a housing shortage already measured in the millions of units, that is a significant projected contraction. It is worth stepping back and asking the question that sits at the center of any serious policy analysis. What were the realistic alternatives, and why were they not chosen? The one alternative would have been to pursue expanded domestic lumber production through targeted investment, workforce development, and sawmill modernization without simultaneously imposing tariffs that raised input costs before domestic capacity could respond. Another alternative would have been a phased tariff structure, tied to measurable benchmarks for domestic production capacity, so that the burden on builders and buyers would only increase as the domestic supply actually came online. A third alternative would have been to pursue renegotiation of the existing anti-dumping and countervailing duty structure with Canada directly, rather than layering an additional Section 232 tariff on top of it. Whether any of these paths would have achieved the administration's stated goals is genuinely uncertain, but they represent the kinds of trade-offs that were available and that, for whatever combination of political, legal, and strategic reasons, were not selected. Media coverage of this issue has tended to follow predictable fracture lines. Some outlets have framed the tariffs primarily as an expression of economic nationalism, a legitimate if costly assertion of American industrial sovereignty. Others have focused on the human cost to buyers and builders, emphasizing the gap between stated housing goals and actual outcomes. What has received less consistent attention is the structural nature of the underlying problem. The decades-long underinvestment in domestic sawmill capacity, the regulatory and environmental constraints on domestic logging that predate this administration by many years, and the genuine difficulty of building industrial capacity at the speed that market demand requires. Understanding those structural factors does not resolve the policy debate, but without them, the debate tends to stay at the surface. The Brookings Institution articulated the core tension with some precision. Across multiple levels of government, there are active efforts to make housing more affordable. Expansions of the low-income housing tax credit, block grants tied to zoning reform, infrastructure investment designed to unlock new construction. All of those efforts are working in one direction. The tariff structure on lumber and building materials is working in the opposite direction, adding costs to the very activity those other policies are trying to encourage. The institution concluded that if the stated goal is to make housing more affordable, trade policy and housing policy need to be pointing the same way. As of early 2026, the situation stands as follows. Canadian softwood lumber faces total duties exceeding 45%. Section 232 tariffs remain legally intact following the Supreme Court's IEEPA ruling. Kitchen cabinet tariffs are at 50%. Furniture tariffs are at 30%. The projected housing shortfall attributable to these cost increases stands at 450,000 units over the next 5 years. The average new home costs somewhere between $9,000 and $17,000 more than it would without these tariffs. Domestic lumber production has not expanded in any meaningful way. And experts continue to project that a significant ramp-up, if it comes at all, is years away. The math of American housing is harder than it was before this policy was implemented. The people caught in that math are not abstractions. They are the renter who cannot find an affordable apartment because not enough units are being built. They are the first-time buyer whose down payment has grown inadequate as prices have risen. They are the small contractor whose bids are no longer competitive because their material costs have jumped and they cannot absorb the difference. And they are the construction worker whose projects have slowed or stopped because the economics stopped making sense. These consequences do not fall evenly. They fall heaviest on those with the least financial cushion, which is to say, us on the people least equipped to bear them. There is still a version of this story that ends differently. Domestic lumber production could, over time, expand to reduce American dependence on Canadian imports. Trade negotiations could produce a revised framework that balances the goals of industrial development and housing affordability. New sawmill investment could begin to close the capacity gap. None of those outcomes are impossible, but they require time, capital, policy coherence, and a willingness to hold the contradictions of the current moment honestly in view. The gap between what was promised and what has occurred is real. The costs are real. And the question that will define the next chapter of this story is not whether those costs existed, but who will ultimately be responsible for addressing them and how. The claim that America does not need Canadian lumber has now collided with the structural facts of American industrial capacity. What the collision has produced is not independence. It is expense. And as the construction data accumulates, as the housing starts continue to decline, and as Canada builds new trade relationships in markets that do not rely on American demand, the window for resolving this contradiction on favorable terms may be narrowing. What comes next is not yet determined. But the choices made in the months ahead will shape the housing landscape of this country for years, perhaps decades, to come. And perhaps that is exactly where the real question begins.